Good evening, everybody. On behalf of the Center for International Human Rights, I would like to welcome you all to this evening's panel discussion on the mental health effects of gender inequality. When we were discussing last year about choosing the theme around which we're going to cluster our series of events for this year, mental health came very quickly without much discussion on top, because it is an issue that has been left relatively unexamined in the human rights literature. Despite the fact that states are committing themselves to help citizens achieve the highest attainable standard of physical as well as mental health, and there hasn't been much progress in the physical health front, as we know, but even less on the mental health front. And yet, it remains a major public health issue for millions of people around the globe. Another thing that reinforced our wisdom, if you want to say, to focus on mental health is when we had our first presenter last fall, who was Dr. Jacob Kumaresan, who is the executive director of the World Health Organization office in New York City, and in the United Nations. And he presented, among the slides that he showed us, quite a fascinating slide in which it compared the public health challenges that the world is facing today and what the list will look like in 2030. And to our astonishment, depressive disorders ranked as the number one public health issue according to WHO. So this is an issue that, at least if the projections of WHO are correct, is going to be even more of a challenge in the years ahead, and we really need to begin a conversation in earnest now. And of course, International Women's Day gave us the opportunity to look at it through the lenses of gender inequality, because there is quite a bit of research that, and it has also been reaffirmed in some international documents, that gender-based inequality adversely affects mental well-being. Issues such as economic dependence, lack of decision-making power, disproportionate domestic responsibilities, and violence can contribute to mental health problems. And you can add a lot of other issues on that list. So we felt, and in order to celebrate International Women's Day, that it would be most appropriate to have a panel discussion on the mental health effects of gender inequality. In closing, I would like to express my thanks to the Gender Studies program, and in particular my colleagues Rosemary Barbare, who just came in, and Samantha Magich, for their willingness to help us with this event and mobilize the community. And I will now give the floor to my colleague Sam Magich, who will introduce the panel and will moderate the discussion to follow. Sam?
So I really don't want to take that much time away from our very fascinating speakers tonight, but I'd like to welcome you all here on International Women's Day. And so sitting here, we have to my immediate left, Ms. Kriti Sharma, who's a fellow in disability rights in the Disability Rights Division at Human Rights Watch. Next to her is Dr. Rama Lakshminarayan, did I get that right? Who's the Senior Advisor, Partnership for Maternal, Newborn, and Child Health at the World Health Organization. She's also a medical doctor. Next to her is Miriam Goodman, who's a coordinator of trafficking programs at the Center for Court Innovation. And finally, at the end of the table is Ms. Nadia Allen, who's the executive director of the Mental Health Association in Orange County. So what we're going to do is, I guess, just go down the row from closest to furthest. Each panelist will make a presentation of about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll open up the discussion to questions from everybody here, which I think will be really exciting. So when you do get up to ask your question, there's a microphone right at the back. So without further ado, I'll turn this over to Kriti Sharma.
Thank you so much for organizing. Should I? Is that better? Yeah. So I'm really pleased to be here, and thank you so much, to you for organizing this event and this panel discussion. I want to share with you some of Human Rights Watch's work on women with psychosocial disabilities in India, and some of our research that we have been doing on the types of violence they face. We find that there's really a continuum of violence. This population, whether it's women or girls, they face violence on a daily basis, and it's very repetitive, again and again and again, whether it's in the home, in the community, or within institutions. I just want to start with a story, and I want to tell you about this woman that I interviewed to just illustrate this. Her name is Sarita. She lives in Bombay, and she was at home. She has a mental disability or a psychosocial disability, which is bipolar disorder. She was, she's in her 30s. She lives in an apartment building in Bombay. She was at home one night, and she heard a knock on the door. She opens the door, and there are two people who look like doctors or a nurse that tell her that they've come from the side of the government and they're vaccinating everybody in the neighborhood. And they want to give her an injection, which is supposed to be a vaccination. She resists, but in the end, they give her an injection, they drug her, and they forcibly abduct her from her home and take her to an institution. The next morning, she wakes up, and Sarita realizes that she's in this mental hospital and she cannot get out. She begs them to let her go. She doesn't understand why she's there, and she's not allowed to leave. She's never presented before a judge or a magistrate. She is not allowed to contact her family. And while she's in this institution, she's subjected to a lot of forced treatment. She's made to swallow pills. She is given even very extreme forms of treatment, such as electroshock therapy. And she's forced to undergo this. She doesn't understand what's happening to her. She's completely drugged out. And when they reduce the doses, she starts asking questions. What is this treatment you're giving me? What is electroshock therapy? She doesn't even know she's being given this treatment. All they tell her is that, I don't know if you're familiar with electroshock therapy. It consists of, giving a current, passing a current to one's brain to trigger an artificial seizure. And she's given this treatment without her knowing. They tell her that she's getting a blood test done. And slowly she starts questioning, if it's a blood test, why are you giving me an injection? Because it's done under anesthesia. Why aren't you withdrawing blood? And slowly, after a course of many months, she realizes that's what's being done to her. It's electroshock therapy. So the reason I'm giving you this example is to illustrate the reality of these women with mental or psychosocial disabilities, and what can happen to them. And this is a very routine example. It's not something that, it's something that we've seen in quite a few women in India, in different states of India, where they're forcibly institutionalized and forcibly treated. The reason I'm giving you this example is to draw attention to the kind of lack of decision-making power these women have in India, and also to draw attention to the gender angle, because this was done to Sarita by her husband. All the husband had to do is tell the hospital to come and pick her up from the home, and all he had to do was sign on the admission forms. She was never asked for her opinion because she did not count. She was characterized as someone who had an unsound mind, which meant she had no legal status in the country. And once she's characterized like that, it's civil death. She can go before a court, but she's not taken seriously because she doesn't count. She has no legal status. And it leads to her, losing control of her property, losing custody of her children, and it can lead to a lot of, abuses and violence against her. Gender is a very major factor in mental health. In terms of, even to just give you some statistics, depression is twice as common in women when compared to men. or even, if we look at conditions like post-traumatic stress disorder, women are disproportionately affected by it because of the high incidence of sexual violence that they face. In 2007, the UN adopted the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which was a major paradigm shift because it recognized that disability was not based on impairment, but disability resulted from a person's interaction with environmental barriers that hindered their full participation. So to explain that very concretely, if someone is in a wheelchair, that's not a disability in itself, but when the person in the wheelchair is trying to cross the road or trying to enter a building and there's no ramp, that creates and results in the disability. And so this was very important because it actually presented the real opportunity for change, as it included rights for these women, specifically rights for women with disabilities and mental disabilities or psychosocial disabilities in particular, including right to healthcare, right to family. And in fact, I should draw attention to the fact that in the disability community, they prefer not to speak of mental health, but to refer to themselves as psychosocial people with psychosocial disabilities, because that draws attention to the interaction with psychosocial barriers. So it presented a big paradigm shift, and it really drew attention to a social model of disability, talking about interaction of barriers. Some of these barriers include discrimination and stigma. We find in India, but in many other countries as well, women with psychosocial disabilities face discrimination and stigma on a daily basis. Disability is seen as something, very often it's seen as a curse. A mental disability can be, in rural areas, people may believe that it's, someone is being possessed by the devil, or it's a curse and they deserve it, or, that it's contagious. And so there are a lot of myths around disability which stigmatize this population. Even within the disability community, people with psychosocial disabilities are very marginalized and isolated, particularly women. For example, I have met women in rural India, for example, I've been told stories about women in rural India who would be chained in their house. They wouldn't even be allowed to go out of the house because, the parents might be working in the field and they don't want her to wander out and lose her way, so she's chained in the house. She may not be allowed to attend, social functions, whether it's weddings, whether it's a social activity like going to school. And so she becomes very, very isolated and marginalized. And that also makes her a target of many forms of violence because she is seen as someone who, if she faces any type of violence or abuse and she tells her story, she will not be believed necessarily because, people might say that, she has schizophrenia and it's, she's telling the story, but it's a figment of her imagination. Or she won't be able to necessarily communicate effectively, or her testimony may not be believed in court. So that actually makes them targets of violence. And these women face many unique forms of violence. As I described to you in the case of Sarita, a woman with a psychosocial disability like her can be forcibly institutionalized without ever going in front of a magistrate, without ever having the right to appeal it. Very often it's for life. I have met women who have been in institutions for decades and decades, and even if they have entered through a court order, the court order can be expired 5-10 years ago, and nobody has bothered to review her case and let her out. It also exposes them to a lot of other forms of forced treatment. I described to you electroshock therapy. It's something that is conducted without their consent. Even if there are consent forms, the consent forms would be signed by family members or by guardians, but never by them, because they are not seen as women and actually people with psychosocial disabilities in countries like India don't have legal capacity. They're stripped of all their legal rights and they're not seen as being capable of making those decisions. Even when it comes to reproductive rights, many women are forcibly sterilized because they're not seen as capable of handling menstruation or capable of becoming a mother. And so many women, for example, may even be separated from their child, their children. The child might be separated from the mother and given up for adoption, and the mother has no say in it. And these are things that happen quite frequently for women with psychosocial disabilities. And it's really a continuum of violence, you know. They face this violence at home, by caretakers, by, you know, in the community, as well as institutions. And because of their lack of, you know, legal status per se, they cannot really appeal it in a court, and they cannot seek redress. So in terms of dealing with this, the CRPD really provides a pathway in terms of a shift from institutional care to community-based care. And those are some of the initiatives that I'd like to draw attention to as examples of models that work, even in resource-poor settings, and that are very effective in catering to the needs of women with psychosocial disabilities, particularly because community-based care is in the community. It reduces stigma, it creates awareness, it provides a social support network for these women. It is also very important to collect data on this population so that for the government to collect data on this population so they can inform policy and provide appropriate and adequate services for this population. And I think it needs to be a policy shift. It's something that, you know, once we see at a legal level, in fact, you know, the reason we are working on this in India is because there are two bills currently in Parliament, one on mental health and one on rights of persons with disabilities, that could provide this opportunity for a policy shift. So I think that's just some of the thoughts and perspectives I wanted to share about our work in India, and I look forward to hearing comments from the panel.
Great, thank you.
Great. Okay, I'm going to shift to a different mode of operation. And first and foremost, I wanted to thank everyone. I think this is a great gift to me on International Women's Day to be with such a distinguished panel and to have such a good audience, young, inquisitive minds. And I hope we'll be able to share some thoughts and learn from your questions today. The reason this was up for so long was because of my last name, so I hope you've all mastered that. But otherwise, as I was introduced, I've just recently joined the World Health Organization. I've actually worked for almost 2 decades with the World Bank in various operations on women's and children's health in East Asia, South Asia, Africa, and some in Latin America. So that's kind of my background. And I just thought I'd reiterate what came up, because I mean the way the World Health Organization defines health is really not just the physical health, but the mental and social health. And it's a complete state of well-being. It's not about just the absence of infirmity or disease. So these are really critical elements to consider when we're looking at health as a whole. And I'm sort of setting mine in the international developing country context, the discussion. But everywhere, I mean, any human being wants to realize your complete potential. You need to cope with normal stresses, you need to work productively, and you need to contribute to your community. So that's really why you need not just the physical, but the mental and social health. I think George already alluded to some of the evidence that's coming about the importance of mental health in the public health arena. And I think the big shift has been, for a long time, public health sort of focused on mortality. And then when you looked at deaths, then it wasn't probably up that high. So you see 10%, even then, it's about 10% of the global burden of disease, that is healthy life years lost. We have various measurements with which we try to quantify whether, there's something you may have heard of disability adjusted life years. So it takes into account how many of your years of living are without disability, so you're actually healthy. And it also takes into account of, obviously, healthy life years lost because of premature death. So if you take the premature death, it's 10%, which is still a significant amount of the global burden of disease. But if you bring in the disability angle, it becomes 25% of the global burden of disease is coming from mental disorders. So that's huge. And then at least 75%. And I'm saying at least because, unfortunately, as you'll see in my future slides, our data is very weak. And it's weakest in the developing countries. So, we are making guesstimates about the volume of the burden of disease, but at least 75% of about 650 million people living with these disorders are in the developing countries. And unfortunately, at least 75% of those people are getting no treatment or no options at all. So that's the big part on the public health priority. It's a huge economic cost. The World Economic Forum came out with the fact that over the next 20 years, there's going to be probably a $16 trillion loss in economic output due to mental disorders. And obviously, I think all of us are very familiar with the human rights perspective and why it's critical. Like I said, it's been grossly underestimated because people just said what ails people is not necessarily what kills them, right? So it's the morbidity that now we are focusing on. It's the lack of data. It's the comorbidity, which is the associated mental illness is there in association with either physical illness or other mental disorders. So for example, you could have depression with anxiety, maybe with a psychosis or not, or you could have patients with cancer, heart disease, etc., which are highly associated with depression. But unfortunately, when we focus on those physical ailments, we tend to treat only that and not treat the mental component of that. And then unfortunately, again, there's limited care seeking for mental illness. So that also results in us underestimating because nobody shows up in facilities or they're not, bumped up to the healthcare communities. And so people feel it's not a problem. And finally, a big constraint, particularly in developing countries, is the inadequate capacity of the health system itself. Even when they see it, they're unable to recognize it. If they're able to recognize it, they're unable to deal with it. So, as I said, it goes both ways, the physical and mental. And there is obviously a biological component to it. I will go into that on the gender differences, and it works both ways. Men don't get away with a lower burden in certain cases. In fact, the alcohol abuse, the psychosis, etc., is actually more common in men than in women. But the more common mental disorders or the highly prevalent ones are more in women. And that's unfortunately what is getting missed a lot, because the more extreme cases of mental illness will likely get bumped up, but the one that's sort of under the radar screen goes untreated. But there's a large number of social, cultural, economic, and environmental factors that affect mental health. And again, it's the vulnerable and marginalized groups that get hit hardest by this. And women, unfortunately, in many of the developing countries fall within that category. I don't know how many of you are aware, but right now the United Nations is going through a very interesting process of setting what we call the Sustainable Development Goals. So the Millennium Development Goals, or the MDGs, are coming to a close in 2015, if I can say close, but there is this whole unfinished agenda of that remaining. But I think what's also why I'm bringing it up here is, in the Millennium Development Goals on health, it was really focusing on maternal health, child health, and some of the communicable diseases like malaria, tuberculosis, and HIV/AIDS. Now, for this round, we are realizing that, yes, there is this unfinished agenda remaining on maternal child health, etc., but there is this huge new focus on non-communicable diseases, mental health, and injuries. And so that goes back to the point you made, that right now itself it's in the top 5, and by 2030 it's going to be probably number 1 if you don't take action. Like I said, there are no marked gender differences in severe mental disorders, but that affects only 2% of the population. But the common mental disorders are much more common in women. Like unipolar depression is twice as common in women, but alcohol and substance abuse is twice as common in men. And unfortunately, that often results in the violence against women that exacerbates their mental disorders. So, this is never a simple equation here. And then the antisocial personality disorders are thrice as common in men as women. Some of the gender-specific risks that have already been alluded to is gender-based violence. I think Kriti also pointed out that the post-traumatic stress disorders are much more common in women. But here what's most interesting is that in the general women's population, it's about 1 in 20 women who suffer from it. But those who have suffered violence, it's 1 in 3. So it dramatically increases the incidence of PTSD. The low income and income inequality is obviously a big factor. It also links up, as I'll show you later, to care seeking, because in many countries, mental health gets very low resources. And when you seek mental health, it's not one of those free health services. So you have to pay for it. And if you don't have the income and you're not in productively earning, then you're unable to seek health care. Of course, there's also the lack of decision-making authority. Again, it works on both sides, because it's lack of decision-making authority that makes you feel helpless, frustrated, and results in mental disorders setting in. But it's also the lack of decision-making authority in going and seeking health care and being able to articulate your needs. And then, of course, the unremitting responsibility for the care of others. And I'm stressing this because what I'd like to focus on, which is a particular interest in developing countries, is the perinatal or the maternal mental health. And that's kind of very closely linked with their caregiving nature of their work. So, and what I sort of is another interesting finding is that when you control for some of these other factors that have been that I mentioned, you can actually reduce the gender difference. It doesn't go away because of these other biological, hormonal factors that are there, but it definitely can be reduced. Interestingly, in high-income countries, women are likely to utilize mental health services more than men, and that's kind of commonsensical if you look at it, because it's not just that women want to show up for more mental health, it's because they have the more highly prevalent mental disorders occur more commonly in women. But in low and low middle income countries, or what we in short form say LICs and LMICs, women are significantly less likely to use mental health services for the very reasons. Care is based on ability to pay, the decision-making authority, provider attitudes. I think Kriti, sort of alluded to it, but it's a huge factor, because you go there and people are like, they can't recognize it, and even if they do recognize it, they attribute it to something that's internal to you rather than something that can be treated, and exogenous factors are responsible for it. There's lack of time because of their caregiving. There's restricted mobility. In many of these countries, women are unable to reach facilities. So it again stresses the importance of community-based care. And that's something that we in the public health arena have not been focusing much on for mental health. We've been able to deliver other kinds of services at the community level, but till very recently, not so much on mental health. And then maybe women are using traditional medicine, so we're not seeing them in the public health system. So it's the same with maternal mental health, because she needs to have the same things that we spoke about in public health. Globally, women of childbearing age, depression is the largest proportion of the disease burden that they suffer. So this is huge, because that's really the most productive time. That's the time when she's also nurturing a family, the community, and it's the largest proportion of the burden of disease. And it's also the second leading cause worldwide, following infections and parasitic diseases. And again, this will change if we don't take action now. Now, maternal mental illness has sort of two sides to the coin. Obviously, we should not forget the mother and her suffering, but unfortunately, it's also very intimately related to her caregiving ability. And children of depressed mothers are at much higher risk for health, developmental, and behavioral problems. So there's an intergenerational disadvantage that sets in. Some of the myths that were there about perinatal depression, because like I said, high-income countries were using it far more, was that, hey, maybe it's not relevant to developing countries. But contrary to that belief, it's actually higher where studies have been done. It's 18 to 25% in low and middle income countries versus about 10 to 15% in high income countries. Suicidal thoughts occur in about 20% of mothers in LICs and LMICs. Again, these are limited studies, more data is required, but it is expanding this knowledge base, whereas it's 5 to 14% in high-income countries. And as I mentioned earlier, infant outcomes are also much worse. These are, again, a repeat of some of those contributing factors, but there's also some additional issues like persistent poor health of the mother that contributes to the mental disorder too, and inadequate spacing is one of the contributing factors. So if there's no family planning available, then it sets all these things in motion. Symptoms, unfortunately, are very generic, and so it's low mood, loss of interest and pleasure, low feeling of self-worth, energy, poor concentration. And then, people say, even here, everyone says, oh, that's the baby blues, right? So, just deal with it. So it's obviously goes undetected or unrecognized. One of the things about maternal depression is that once it sets in, it can become chronic, and it can recur with future pregnancies and can substantially impair. Of course, you have these extreme cases where the mothers are killing their children in utter sort of depression. But that's not necessarily the outcome, but it can be substantially impairing nevertheless. And suicide is being bumped up as one of the more, less commonly associated maternal mortality factors. Because if you take the perinatal period and you go from pregnancy right up to the first year of birth, first year after birth, then there is a significant number of women who are actually even committing suicide in these countries. I talked about the MDGs, or the Millennium Development Goals, and the fact that we missed that opportunity, but we should not and cannot and will not miss that opportunity this time. I think there's a very strong sense that mental health should be included. It should also be included, like I said, to broader development. So it's not just the health sectors that should be focusing on it. It's on poverty reduction, it's on gender empowerment. And again, it's very nice to see that the open working group, that is all the member states, have come out with their first draft of focus areas. And gender equality is a specific focus area in addition to promotion of equality across other social determinants of health. It should also be an integral component. One should not sort of specify that mental health is separated from maternal and child health or overall health systems. It really needs to get integrated into it because the delivery channels and the platforms are the same. It's also important, like I said, that we take it down to the community level. So it's the primary as well as the secondary care. And we need to sensitize because it's not just the national, but also the international donors, for example, especially in some of the really poor countries, they do not recognize it. They focus on certain agendas, and mental health has not come up as one of those agendas until now. The health sector itself can screen during antenatal visits, so it's not something that has to be done separately. Training all healthcare professionals, not just mental health professionals. I think in the West, it's about 1 in 200,000, 120,000 to 200,000. In developing countries, it's 1 in 2 million mental health specialists per person. So we really cannot change that very dramatically soon. So we really need to start educating other cadres of health workers to recognize it. And of course, availability of basic drugs, psychotherapeutic care, and treatment for use by non-specialists. So there's also a research agenda that's waiting for us. But resource allocation, human resources, and weak health systems still plague us. Nevertheless, there are some interesting programs that have come up in developing countries, so we don't have to say that we can't do anything because we can't address everything. There's the Thinking Health program in Pakistan, where these lady health workers were given very short training program. It's only a 2-day program, and then they come for a refresher. but they start meeting with these the pregnant women from the last month of pregnancy right through to the first year, completion of first year after birth. And it shows that just by integrating cognitive behavior interventions into the routine work of these community health workers, you can halve depression among these prenatally depressed women. And they actually had a control groups too who got enhanced routine care. So they were seeing the community health workers, but they were not getting this cognitive intervention, behavior intervention. And the infants also did better on several fronts. They had less of diarrheal episodes. They had better breastfeeding, happening. And so hopefully the future nutrition, it also resulted in better maternal bonding. And actually the parents were also playing more with the kids. So there was also this cognitive development angle to early childhood development. And interestingly, people thought that, even if the mothers found it useful, the health workers are going to complain because it's additional work for them. But they felt more useful, that it was more useful and relevant because they were treating treating the needs of this woman, catering to her needs holistically. And they felt that it was a big step forward for them too. This is just to show you how the rates of depression drop between the control group and the intervention group. And similarly, there's a perinatal mental health program in urban South Africa, in Cape Town, where, again, it reinforces that you can train maternity health workers to do the screening. They can, when properly trained, they can manage their workload and include this screening within it. And that on-site screening and counseling sets up efficient referral systems, because once they're able to screen and find out which women need it, and it actually showed that 90% of the women were getting screened, and there was a 95% uptake in counseling and referrals from this program. So again, the idea is that you would have, there are several possibilities to deal with this at the developing country context too. There are several, again, I think, as our knowledge about the burden of this disease comes forth, and we are getting some evidence on some useful programs, there's a mental health action plan that the WHO has come up with for the next 7 years. There's also an assessment instrument that can be used by countries to check how their health systems are catering to mental health. There's what's called the Mental Health Gap Action Plan that looks at the gaps within your health system to deal with mental health and make the necessary changes and adjustments. And as part of the quality rights, this Mind Bank that WHO has set up actually has all the policies, the legislation, the beyond just health. It's on disabilities, it's on mental health too as part of that. And there's a very important publication that brought out the evidence for action in investing in mental health. So I'll stop there and look forward to hearing some questions from you. Thank you.
My name is Miriam Goodman, and I work for the Center for Court Innovation. I am their coordinator of trafficking programs, and I have the honor of working with in New York City in the human trafficking intervention courts that have been recently developed, as well as doing state and national technical assistance and consultation on different issues relating to trafficking, particularly sex trafficking, from a policy level to a clinician level. My background is I'm trained as a trauma-focused social worker, and I've spent years working with survivors of trauma and just drank the Kool-Aid of a trauma perspective. So my presentation is coming from there, from a perspective of how trauma, interpersonal and more macro level forms of oppression impact people. But before I go into this, just to shake people up a little bit, because it's dinner time and you've been hearing very uplifting presentations for the last few minutes. One theme that you've heard from everybody that spoke so far is this idea of stigma and judgment and stereotype, and how on every possible level that really has an impact on everyone, and today to talk about women. and just to interrupt myself, I feel very rude. Thank you for inviting me to be here and to be on a panel with such distinguished people. So before I start, please feel free to shout out. When you hear the word prostitute, what are the things that come to your mind? And I won't judge you for saying them. We can just say they're social judgments. Please. What just comes to mind? Prostitute.
Sex worker.
Yeah. What else?
Corner.
Great. I know you're all thinking things. I can see it. What comes to mind? What's the judgment?
Streetwalker.
Great. Woman. Streetwalker. Desperate. Huh? Teens. Did I hear change?
Shame.
Shame. Great. Okay. So you have that. Sex trafficking victim. What comes to mind? Come on, shout out, no judgments. I do groups with women who are survivors of this, and they're quicker to shout these things out. So
Foreign.
Foreign.
Young.
Young. Okay. Anything
Coercion.
else? Coercion.
Being tricked.
Okay. So the point being that we all hold, even if you didn't say it, judgments and stereotypes of these two words. And I am going to focus on talking about women who are survivors of sex trafficking, and the reason I put out the word prostitute is that in my work, I work with a lot of women, men, and trans women who are arrested on prostitution-related charges in alternative to jail programming. And so there's definitely people here, those two words are often coming up together. Not to say that everyone that's involved in prostitution is a victim of trafficking. I'm not saying that, I'm just focusing in on sex trafficking survivors. So without further ado, okay. So just a little background, what is human trafficking? So in 2000, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act was passed, and this is federal legislation, and it defined people who are the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for sex trafficking in which a commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or you're under 18 years old and you're induced to perform a commercial sex act. Just as a FYI, in New York State, we're one of the 2 states in the country that treat 16 and 17-year-olds as adults in the criminal court. And so this is federal legislation, but how that translates into action in New York has been very complicated because 16 and 17-year-olds are seen as adults within criminal court. Very recently, like a month ago, there was an amendment to this, what's called the Safe Harbor Act, which recognized that people 15 and under who were involved in any sort of commercial sexual exploitation are victims of trafficking, and it is now expanded to include 16 and 17-year-olds. The impact of what that will do within the court system is still very much being figured out, and how that's going to work when you have someone that's in adult criminal court now being seen as a young person. So more to come as everyone figures it out, but we're all working to try to understand it. And I have these terms on the bottom because these are terms that are commonly associated when talking about trafficking, sex trafficking, foreign-born versus domestic, pimp-controlled, and CSEC, right? Commercial sexual exploitation of children. I have worked with all different types of survivors, but again, today I'm focusing in on domestic pimp-controlled prostitution. While it is International Women's Day, our community that we live in right here is part of the international community, and there are women who are experiencing, not that there isn't an extreme form of trafficking, but horrific events of sex trafficking. Okay, so the 3 key elements in when thinking about sex trafficking are force, fraud, and coercion. And they seem simple enough, but like everything, they're actually extraordinarily complicated to break down. So this is just to understand what are some examples of these different elements. Force being obviously physical force or sexual assault or emotional abuse. Branding, meaning it can be anything from tattoos to burns to all sorts of things. Fraud, so I'm going to talk in a minute about what pimp-controlled prostitution and pimp-controlled trafficking looks like. And part of what happens is it's not just the idea that there's this big bad person who kidnaps you and takes you away, and that does happen. But what happens more often in my work is that a person, most often a man, pretends to be someone's boyfriend. You fall in love with this person, and then love just confuses everything, trafficking or not. And so now it's very confusing because this person that's hurting you and manipulating you and controlling you, you also have an intimate partner relationship with. So like fraud, promising making money, you can read this, coercion, exposing a secret. If you leave, I'm going to tell everyone in our community that you're nothing but, using language I've heard, nothing but a hoe, right? Like that's what I'm going to let everyone know. I'm going to tell your family, everyone's going to know. And that's a reason to not leave someone. Threats to call authorities for people who are not here legally is also been a huge experience of people. And so this fear, secrecy, and shame, you can mix it up and put them on any of those three elements, but that those three key elements are a part of why these experiences have been kept so hidden and silent, and they also, in a minute we're going to go to trauma, correspond to the hallmarks of trauma. People who experience interpersonal trauma, there's secrecy and shame and fear of disclosure. So when you combine the experience of sex trafficking with trauma, you have so much shame and so much fear and so many secrets that it feels really hard to know where to begin in addressing this. Okay, so domestic, pimp-controlled prostitution, trafficking. So just a little background, you might hear the term traumatic bonding is often used. Love, this idea, I've started using this word that a woman that I worked with used, which is her intimate partner pimp, right? It's her partner that she has children with. He's also her pimp who's exploiting her and hurting her. What a confusing balance of things. So, often women might be turned out at a young age, meaning that they begin engaging in this life, they call it the life, at a young age because of experiences that maybe were going on at home, whether it's abuse, as everyone's mentioned, violence that are high rates. LGBT young people are at a very high rate of leaving home at a young age, whether they were not accepted at home, it was unsafe. They end up, having to figure out ways to survive. Sometimes this is one of those situations that results in running away. And that pimps, traffickers, they often provide the basics for someone. They provide shelter, food, clothes, basic needs, a sense of safety, this promise of a future, of family, and love, or at least that's what it's called. And I put family because actually in the world, in the life, in this pimp-controlled world, the language that's used to describe it is very much a recreation of family, in a very I can never say that word, in a patriarchal, thank you, society. So the pimp is called daddy, and the women that all work for him are each other's wife-in-laws, and together collectively they're folks or a stable, which is not really human, but a group. And so the language is intentional in recreating this idea that you are a part of something, that you belong to something. And if you haven't belonged to much, or you've been through so much violence and abuse by people who are supposed to care for you and or strangers, it is very attractive to find somebody or someplace that at least in the beginning seems like it might be a sense of belonging. Isolation, so kept in a super insular community. Again, this stable of folks is this terminology. Recreation of family, using other women. In this recreation, the woman who's the number one is actually called the bottom bitch, which is a really interesting thing that you're on the bottom if you're number one, and I'm not sure why. And that she's really in control and can hurt other women and coerce other women. And so you think about gender and violence, again, gendered violence, and we usually often think of it as men hurting women. And here, to just add to complication, it's women also hurting women, just to throw in another complication. And money, and sense of worth. So, with trauma, and interpersonal trauma in particular, it really can impact a person's feelings of self-worth. And so people do all sorts of things to cope with feeling as though they are worthless and are hopeless and are helpless. And so many women that I've worked with have talked about how good it feels to be handed a certain amount of money that is determining their worth. Granted, they don't keep any of that money. It is not theirs. It goes to their pimp, and there's lots of other things that come up with that. But it's really interesting to think about that idea of worth and what it means to people and what it means to the women. Okay, trauma. So I've used this word a lot. This is a very long definition of trauma, but I do think it's important to acknowledge the micro, the interpersonal, so one person causing harm on another, but also macro. I work with the court systems a lot, so the systemic trauma and oppression that goes on, the racism and every sexism and every other ism that is out there, impacts a person as well. So trauma reactions. So the reason I brought this up is, we're here to talk about mental health. I do know that. And for me, in the training that I've received and working with the population that I've worked with, and what other panelists have said tonight, is the high rates of PTSD, which results from trauma, and usually ongoing chronic trauma and abuse. And that trauma reactions, the symptoms of trauma, are very much can mimic other types of, or look just like other types of mental health symptoms, or chronic ongoing trauma can cause other types of mental health issues. But what can happen is when we don't put it back into the context of the experiences that this person's had. So it can be treated as this isolated thing that doesn't have any connection to the experiences that a person goes through. Many women that I've worked with, abuse starting from the moment they were born to the moment that they come up from rape, sexual abuse, physical abuse, neglect, torture, everything you can possibly think of. And so when you start looking through, these are the main criteria for PTSD. And so when you start looking at some of these reactions, I call them reactions, but symptoms, they make a lot of sense if you've been hurt and abused over and over again, right? So you might have intrusive thoughts and feelings, and you might have hyperarousal, which really is very similar to ADD or ADHD. You might have dissociation, which is its own disorder and can also sometimes look like personality disorder, but it's really rooted and based in the trauma. And so for me, and the training and the programming that I run, we really try to understand that when people go through what they're going through, when these women go through what they're going through, that it's going to come out in all different ways, and that we need to understand to remove some of the pathology and understand that humans react to their environment. And how this all comes together is, I forgot about this slide. This is just, again, the secrecy, shame, hallmarks of trauma. So you think about societal judgment, social judgment, stigma, and these two words that I've heard from many people that hold so much to them. And so I think when you think about mental health and how to go forward in terms of working with people, that understanding what goes on with what these two words hold, how much stigma, how much judgment, how much of our normative culture also impacts particularly pimp-controlled prostitution. The show Pimp My Ride, listen to some music, these words are used, it's normalized, trauma reactions the traumatic experiences of women can be really normalized. And so just to challenge what we know of these isolated symptoms and to bring it back to what this person has gone through. So it's kind of changing from what's wrong with you to what has happened to you, what have you been through that's connected to these symptoms and reactions. And the reason that I find this helpful and important, not this slide necessarily, but in general, is that when you're, my perspective, I guess, is much more on the individual and micro. When you're talking to a person and you understand them as a human who has been through horrible, horrible things, and their mind, body, and soul are trying to figure out how to survive it, it's going to look like all sorts of bizarre and hard to understand and challenging symptoms, reactions, but if you can understand them as a human reacting to it, to an experience, you can connect to a human and really begin to do that work of healing and treatment in any sort of capacity. And it's not just in their mental health. I could not agree more with what you had said about communities needing to be a wraparound and all involved. If you think about a trauma survivor or victim of trafficking that I've worked with, the last thing they want to do is go to a doctor that doesn't have any idea of what they've been through, because being touched is not something that feels okay. And so coming from a trauma-informed perspective, you can, knowing if you know that what your client has been through and that might, going to a doctor or going to ask for help might be a really hard thing, and a normal reaction to the abnormal experiences that they've had, abnormal meaning in an ideal world no one should be hurt, can really help you, the person begin that treatment. So for our programming, we do trauma-informed work, which is kind of counterintuitive and in opposition to the criminal justice system, but we try to do it anyway to kind of begin to make the change in how people feel when they're going through the court system, strengths-based work. So I talked a lot about trauma. I tried to use the word survivor because I believe in it more often than victim, and that when we overly victimize, when you think of women and victim, you often, what you might not admit it in here, but what might come to mind is weak or helpless, or like this person who's going to be crying and asking you for help. And let me tell you, the people who are needing of the most support and help, they do not come, that's not how they're coming in. They're coming in to your office with a huge different attitude, not necessarily the good victim that you're expecting. And so to be mindful that that victim is also figured out how to survive for the last however many years, and acknowledging that as part of the conversation of disability and mental health and response, that people know themselves the best, and they have figured out ways to get by, even if it's extremely unhelpful. They have figured out how to survive, and the more that we can recognize that resiliency, I think it's going to be better in our interactions with survivors. And healing is a process. So the programming I run is very short term, and we really look at ourselves as a step one in a very long process of healing, and that you can really begin to make that change in someone's life, and then at a larger level, just in that first 5 minutes or five hours that you're with a person. And I think that gets left out when we have discussions about how mental health and people in general, that it's not just for psychotherapists who are doing long-term therapy where engagement and respect and healing starts. It's everybody across the board. And that is really it in a nutshell. I feel like I raced. Sorry, I tried to condense like 5 hours of thoughts into like 5 slides. Here's my information, and I can't wait to hear from all of you guys. Thank you so much.